Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Colin, for the invitation to present here today. So I'm Cronan McNamara, founder and CEO of a company called Crème Global. We're based in Dublin, Ireland, and I describe us as a data science technology company with a lot of history in the food safety, nutrition and chemicals space. So I'd like to tell you about our thoughts and vision, I suppose, for data science and how it can help and how it is helping the food industry. So I'll start with a little bit of toxicology, move into data science, and then finally make some suggestions about how we can collaborate better to share data, structure data, and make better decisions using analytics and predictive models. Do we have any toxicologists in the room? Hands up? No? Okay. Quick lesson on toxicology. I'm a techie. I started out in physics, but I've been, and then I went into computing. But I spent the last 20 years or so in food safety and looking at things like risks and hazards. So, in a very simple way, you can think about food safety risk as a combination of the hazard, so food safety hazard, and an exposure. So, one without the other isn't particularly dangerous or a cause for concern. And why we think about food safety, and Ian mentioned it, for international trade, setting standards for safety and nutritional values of products is really important. So risk and food safety can be expressed in this way. So what is a hazard exactly? So a hazard is an inherent property of the chemical, and since we're in the Royal Society of Chemicals, of Chemistry, it's on its own. It's the property of that ingredient or chemical, which is important. So this is the difference between a hazard and a risk. So you can see here the property of the snake is it's poisonous. The risk in both scenarios is quite different. And that's because of the risk of exposure to the human in this case. So in a sense, when we're thinking about food safety and chemicals, we can also think about things that are in foods. But if the population, our consumers, are not exposed to them in an adequate amount, there is no risk. So bear with me on that for a moment. And I'm going to expand on this equation, and then I'm going to talk about some of the data science that we've been doing to underpin this, and also think about nutritional scenarios and how we can ultimately have an impact on health for consumers. So in the modern world, we can actually think about individuals in a lot more detail than we could before. So in the past, we used to just have exposure and hazard implying risk. But now we can also think that, well, certain people are more susceptible to risks than others. And we can measure that better now through studies of genotype and phenotype, and we're understanding a lot more about the risk to health or the benefits to health of different ingredients and different chemicals and different hazards. And if we think about hazard, exposure, and then vulnerability, right in the center, we can think about individuals and start to think about how this affects the food industry. Where in the past, we'd think about the UK population and we'd provide one common food that fits everybody. But with the more cheaper data that we're getting from people's personal information, from their habits, their preferences, even their genotype and phenotype, which is more measurable these days, then we can provide much more tailored solutions to those consumers. So I want to talk about that in a digitized world. So what do I mean by digitized world? Well, the first concept I'll talk about is digital density. We all know that data is exploding, and this is a massive challenge, but also an opportunity. So data is just growing exponentially. Data is coming from all sources. And the idea of digital density is that in the past, only the largest factories, maybe 4 in the UK, would have had an internet connection and a mainframe computer in their facility in the 70s, let's say. And I think IBM famously predicted that there would only be a need for 4 mainframe computers in the world. But of course, that was wrong. And as we transferred through the ages, throughout the early 90s, every office had some kind of connection to the internet. be rudimentary, dial-up. In the late mid-90s, every single home would have connected into the internet. And you can see the density of internet connections is growing rapidly. And of course, the data which is getting generated expands exponentially on the back of that digital density. Of course, in 2007, every single person had their own personal connection to the internet through their smartphone, or actually carrying around supercomputers in our pockets. And of course, now in the late 2010, 2015 onwards, we're seeing not just every person has a connection to the internet, but everything is almost connected to the internet. So your fridge, your car would have 15 connections to the internet these days, 15 different connections. We're seeing every single device now connected to the internet. This is, of course, Internet of Things, and it is impacting on everything we do today. So the digital density is just expanding exponentially and rapidly, and that's causing an avalanche of data, which is a huge challenge, but also a huge opportunity, and it's going to transform the way we do business. And the food industry is, of course, no different. So let me talk about that in a digitized world. So in terms of food safety or nutrition, this is one thing we've been doing for a long time. It is looking at exposure or intakes of ingredients or foods or chemicals. And we call it predictive intake modeling. And this relies a lot on data and computer models. So basically, it's a simple enough process. We need to understand what foods people are consuming, what's in those foods in terms of the nutritional composition, or the potential chemicals or hazards that could be in the food supply. And combining those two pieces of information, we can understand something about the population's consumption of nutrients or foods or exposure to a chemical or hazard. So we have food consumption data, which we use in the first input to our model. And you're probably familiar with the UK NDNS food survey. So this will be a classic input here into the model. So this is where the UK government is funding a consumption survey and repeating that on a rolling basis now and surveying the population to understand the foods and preferences of consumers. And they do that on a representative basis where demographic groups are represented so you can model the UK population. In terms of what's in the food, if we're looking at hazards, these are measured by the likes of the Department of Agriculture monitoring programs for pesticides. And again, when it comes to trade, international trade on food and food safety, they have a very important role on checking imports and exports for consistency with regulations. So the government will be monitoring chemical hazards in the food supply for raw agricultural commodities. The NDNS survey will be measuring nutritional composition of foods. Industries has to report their nutritional composition of food. And when you combine all of that, you start to understand a lot more about consumption of nutrients across a population like the UK or any other population. So you end up with a data distribution of population nutritional intakes or a potential risk distribution of population exposure to chemicals or things that may be harmful in the long term, or even acute hazards. And when you look at this data distribution, of course, you're going to have people consuming more or less of certain things. You can break this down by age, demographic, and maybe look at the mean consumer. So what's the mean intake of white bread in the UK? Or what's the mean intake for women between the ages of 18 and 35 for white bread? The mean is interesting. You can also look at the median, but often you're interested in the high consumers, and you're wondering about, well, what's the 95th percentile consumption of sodium, or what's the exposure of the 95th percentile in children to different ingredients or different chemicals in the food supply. So all of this is possible now by combining these data sets in a model. And you end up with a distribution like this. And it wouldn't typically be so smooth, but you would have your bell curve of intake in most foods or most chemical exposures. And what you're interested in then is looking at intakes or exposures in milligrams per kilogram per day across the population. And if there's a chemical that you're concerned about, say a pesticide or a nutrient, you might want to compare that to your safe dose for that particular hazard. And that dose is calculated typically through toxicology studies or computational toxicology. You try to compute, well, what is the sustainable dose in milligrams per kilogram per day that you do not want your population to exceed. And then you can look at, well, is there a risk that certain people within our group are going to exceed that dose? And if so, who are they? And what foods are contributing to that? And what reformulation scenarios should we be looking at to try to refine that scenario? And I'll give you some examples of this in a moment. So if this is all a bit theoretical, hope not. If it's a nutrient, you may be more concerned that people are getting enough of that nutrient. So you can look at the minimum intake for certain nutrients and make sure that enough of your demographic groups are getting enough of that particular nutrition to be healthy. So these are some of the examples that we can do. In terms of individuals, there's a new concept called personalised nutrition that we've been working on in Creme with some partners around Europe. There was a project called Food for Me. And in terms of understanding at a population level nutritional requirements, with the, I suppose, next generation sequencing that's emerged over the last couple of decades, and this graph is just showing the cost per genome sequenced and the rate of cost reduction in that as compared to Moore's law. And we know Moore's law is a rapid cost reduction in computing power, but actually the cost of sequencing genomes has by far outstripped the pace of reduction of computing power. So this has transformed on our understanding, on our potential to understand people and organisms at a far more detailed genomics rate than was ever possible before. But what that means is that we can now predict and we can measure personalised nutrition and health and apply that to predictive models for health. So following the genomic revolution, you could call it, whereas before we had to treat everybody the same. We had to think about populations. We couldn't include genetic information. We didn't understand, bacteria down to specific details as we can now, and the cost that we can do now. So what's possible now with this data is far more fine-tuned predictive models. We can quantify bacteria pathogenic strains at an economic cost now for food safety. We can look at personalised effects. Personalised nutrition and personalised health is now all possible, whereas before it was too prohibitively expensive to do. So we can understand food and ecosystems and their dynamics. So in the Food for Me project, what we did was we had 2,000 consumers around Europe, and we asked them a series of questions about themselves, and we asked them to fill in a food frequency questionnaire on their diets. But we also took bloods and a swab from each person. And what we're doing there is we're measuring the phenotype and genotype of each of the individuals in the project. And in the study, then, we assigned randomly the 2,000 people into 4 different groups, and we looked at providing personalised nutritional recommendations to those groups. And the 4 different groups, the 0th group or the control group, they just got standard nutritional advice like eat 5 fruit and vegetable a day, reduce red meat, increase different water consumption, for example. But then in the other three groups, we started to increase the personalization of those nutritional recommendations. So in the first group, it was based on their basic information: age, gender, body weight, and some of the food data that they filled in. So it was personalized advice. In the next group, it was based on all of that, plus measures from their blood of their phenotype. And in the final group was the most detailed personalized nutrition. It was based on all of that information, and the recommendations were also based on measures of their genotype. And the results of the project were that people did adopt the personalized advice more readily and change their diets based on the more detailed or more personalized advice that they got. In another study, this was done by Dr. Doppler Nelson in Stanford, and this was quite interesting in that 101 women were assigned 4 different diets over a year. And these diets were specifically designed based on different genotypes of the individuals. And then the individuals are randomly assigned the diets. So what happened in this study was that you can see in the graph the incorrect genotype for a diet, they did lose some weight and the BMI was reduced. But the people assigned the correct diet designed for their specific genotype did better in terms of the study. So their phenotype, which is the BMI that they were interested in, reduced better with a diet specifically designed for their genotype than the randomly assigned people on the diet. So now that we can measure this stuff more cheaply and effectively than ever before, we can actually implement that data and combine it with other data sources that people can provide on their personal information. We can now move to an age of much more personalized choices and personalized solutions. So for the agriculture sector, what does that mean for you? That's a big question. For the retail sector, what does it mean for you? Maybe personalized recommendations, personalized shopping. But it is an interesting question, and it is the way the data and the internet is bringing us. In personalized medicine, we know that we are starting to understand how we can assign, or how drugs can be effective, not at a population level, but at subpopulation level, again, based on genotype. So this information is becoming critically important, where a drug could be beneficial, but toxic to a certain group. It could be beneficial, not toxic to another group, and it could have no effect and be toxic to another group. So all of this data is starting to become available, and the science is underpinning it. So let me talk a little bit about what I see as the food safety and nutrition, the future of food safety and nutrition in a digitized world. I think of it as a data science challenge. Once all of this data is starting to become available and we can start structuring that data and understanding the implications of that data, well, then we need to understand how to do the data science or the modeling to help us all make better decisions in our own sectors and our own industries. And data science is an interesting thing. Everyone thinks about AI and machine learning, and that's kind of at the top of this pyramid, but most of the work actually goes in at the bottom of this pyramid. And it's all about collecting and understanding the data and sharing that data often in order to generate some insights, and that can be simple visualizations or analytics on the data. And then eventually, you can start to get to predictive modeling at the top. So if you think about the best companies in the world at predictive analytics and machine learning and modeling these days, it's these born on the internet companies. And they were designed from day one to get that data and structure it and understand it and collect it. The food industry was not set up like that. So there's a lot of work to get from where we are now to a place where we have structured data, we're sharing that data, we're collecting that data, we're able to share it securely, anonymously, and help the industry as a whole make better decisions. So let me talk a little bit about that. Gathering data, food consumption data. How am I doing for time, Colin? Okay. So food consumption data, the traditional way was pen and paper. We used to, the NDNS and other organizations would go around with dietitians asking people what they ate yesterday and fill it in on a piece of paper. That's all gone digital, and that opens up bigger opportunities to survey tens of thousands of people or hundreds of thousands of people, whereas before we used to have a few thousand people. And of course, there's all of these apps these days like MyFitnessPal and other diet apps where people are filling in data. But if you want scientific data, there are now different validated tools, and Food for Me is the one we worked on, and Foodbook24 are two that we worked on that provide that information. There's also interesting alternative data sources like Mintel, like these crowdsourced data, like data donors, people are volunteering their information, and they're starting to share that data in a secure and collaborative environment, again, all facilitated by the internet. Of course, IoT, which we mentioned, is becoming cheaper and cheaper in factories and in farms. We're measuring pH, humidity, temperature, time every few minutes on all your production facilities. And that can be correlated with quality, safety, and outputs. And once those data sets are built up, they can be understood. So briefly then, moving up the stage, understanding data. Interesting example here. This graph is actually a very cheap IoT device that we installed in the fridge in our office, just for fun, just to see what data came out. So it's provided by a company called Alto. I think it costs about $30. And it does temperature, it does humidity, it does vibration, and it just goes to the internet and we have a look at it. So turns out this was a Friday. You can see nothing much happened for the following 2 days. It was the weekend. And I think we must have had drinks that evening because we were loading the drinks into the fridge here, and then the temperature went up a little bit as people continued to take drinks out of the fridge in the Friday afternoon. So just simple insights that came from having a very cheap sensor in our office fridge. But it just shows you that this stuff is pervasive and very easy to install and access to data. Finally, once you have kind of gathered structured data and started to organize it, you can create more powerful predictive models. So you can see from that trending of that data, perhaps over time, you might be able to predict what might happen in the future. So in terms of a couple of examples that we've done in predictive analytics, microbiology, this is shelf life kind of model for Listeria growth predictor under different formulations. Hope you can read that. I will share the slides, so if Colin and his colleagues can send them out, that'd be great. So this just says moisture, sodium chloride, pH, and the concentration of a preservative called eliminate, and different scenarios around environmental conditions. So all of that, we had a lot of experimental data. What we did is created a predictive model, and ultimately that can predict the shelf life of the products under different formulations, and reduces the time, I suppose, for R&D in terms of checking out new formulations. In terms of nutrition and health modelling, this is an interesting one that, kind of reflecting on Ian's thinking, this was done with the food and drink industry in Ireland, under pressure from the Irish government to make food healthier, essentially. So they voluntarily got together under the IBEC Food and Drink Group, and they wanted to look at 5 major macronutrients: sodium, sugar, saturated fat, trans fat, and calories. And they wanted to show how they're reformulating those products over 10 years and what the impact would be on Irish consumers. So what we did was gathered those formulations from 10 years ago, and then we modeled the impact of those formulations on consumers in terms of their sodium, calorie intakes, etc., and looked at the reformulations and market shares over time and benchmarked it again and showed the reduction of sodium in those products and what impact that would have on consumers. So instead of talking about tons removed of sodium in the Irish marketplace, we could say that, for example, I'll move on to the next slide. So gathering the data, for example, Irish adults had a 45% reduction in their sodium intake over those 10 years based on that reduction model and based on the reformulations of those products. And that just shows that these kind of initiatives can work if companies are willing to share that data in a way that can be modeled in a robust way to show the progress they're making. So finally, my thoughts on food safety and nutrition in a digitized world is that we need to start using all the data and that it is essentially a data science challenge. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Cronan. I know the programme says we'll take questions after the next speaker, but I think they're two unrelated topics, so let's just have one question, time for one. Yes, the lady with a hand up there. Barbara, could you get the microphone?
Yep.
Hi, that's really interesting, absolutely fascinating topic. I did want to just press you on the ethics of what you're talking about with personalised nutrition, because obviously if you're gathering people's data, who's going to own that data, but also from the side of availability and accessibility, if you're somebody who's lacking in a certain nutrient and you need to get it, would you be able to afford that analysis that's going to give you that information?
Yeah, and this isn't expensive actually to do this analysis, and that's, I guess it does cost money today, and as I was showing the cost of these types of, and I suppose the most expensive part is doing that genetic swab and the phenotype measurement at the start, but that's coming down. This was a proof of concept, it was a research project, but again, we're hoping that these kind of technologies and opportunities will be open broadly to everyone. And from the government's point of view, prevention is better than cure, and if you can keep your population healthy, it's better than having to treat illness. So there should be funding there to hopefully help with, people who can't afford to avail of these types of technologies and services, I would think.
Okay, I think in the interest of time, Cronan, sorry, we're going to have to move on, but thanks very much.
Thank you.